Hello everybody, this is Sergio again. This video is going to be a short one compared to the other ones. Like I've told you, I am going to make a series of games in JavaScript so you could learn how to do different things in JavaScript. I'm going to start off with simple games, which I'm going to remake all the Atari games. Then I'm going to move on to make all the Nintendo games, then all the Sega games, and so on and so on. So there's going to be hundreds of games being made here. And before I make any games, it's good to have some code which I could reuse across all the games. An example code is graphical user interface, so that you could control the window size, the orientation. So you could display menus like a dialog window asking you if you want to quit, or a dialog window displaying your high score and asking you to input your score. Or even Windows just displaying a message saying that it's waiting for another network player to connect so you could play with an opponent across the network. So I'm going to be building a graphical user interface library, which I'm going to be using in all the games. But even before that, I'm also going to be building one simple function. I actually didn't build this function. I got it off the internet a long time ago when I was learning how to program, and I use it a lot. Now, programming games, it's very useful if you use object-oriented programming. Even building a graphical user interface is very useful doing it with object-oriented programming, because there's inheriting objects and reusing code and functions across different objects is very useful. This video is not on what object-oriented programming is. It's just on one simple thing. JavaScript has the ability to do object-oriented programming. But the old code, the old JavaScript code, not the new code is easy, but in the old JavaScript code, and I like to write code for browsers which are old as possible, so that'll be as compatible with as many devices as possible. Inheritance was not a very simple thing, so I had to write a function, which I didn't actually write. I found it on the internet, but I use it a lot, which allows me to inherit things rather easily. Now, like I've said, this video is not a video on what inheritance is, just on how to implement it in JavaScript. You should know what object-oriented is already coming here, because I'm not going to explain it in this video. I might do another video explaining it. I'm just going to talk about a function that I'm going to use, which is going to allow me to inherit the methods and the variables from different objects into new objects, which is a very useful thing when you're coding. Object-oriented programming is very useful. So let's start by writing the function. Okay. Let me log in as an administrator. Now, all my reusable code, all my library, I'm gonna put it in different folders. My JavaScript code, I'm gonna put it on the folder called lib for library. And JS for JavaScript. I'm gonna also have some library which is like for codes for PHP and things like that. So I'm breaking it down this way: lib JS for JavaScript libraries, lib PHP for PHP libraries. Now this new function that I'm going to write, I'm going to call it extend. I could call it inherit. I could call it a lot of things, but JavaScript seems to use the word extend and the newer class functions to extend to inherit uh, methods. Methods are function methods and variables from other objects. So I'm gonna keep it the same. Okay. Okay, so let me just write down the function, okay? Just 1 second. It's hard to write down the code and hold the microphone at the same time. I should have had a mic holder, but I'm not that prepared. So it's just a simple function called extend. You pass it, you give it a child object and a parent object. And pretty much what this function does is that all the variables and all the functions or the methods in parents will get passed over to child. So child will inherit all the variables and all the methods of the parent object. Okay, so we do this. This is how it's done in the old way. Old way means compatible with as much browsers, which with as many browsers as possible. We create a function, an empty function. Now, the prototype is where the prototype method is where you stored all the variables and the functions which you could override. There's other ways of overriding stuff, but this is the way that was created a while back to make inheritance easy. So first of all, we create an empty function. And the prototype of the empty function gets the prototype of the parent functions. I'm sorry. What am I saying? Parent function. Okay, so right off the bat, what we're doing was creating empty functions. In the prototype is where all the variables and functions which can be overwritten. There's other ways of overriding it, but this is the way it was originally set up. Is on the prototype. So all the variables and functions that parents has are stored in prototype, and they get copied over to this empty function. Then we take our child function, a child object, and we'll give it a copy of all the variables and functions in the empty object that we created. An empty function is pretty much like an empty object. So we have this empty object called F. We copy all the variables and functions of parent over to F. Now in child, we take all the variables and function of child, and we make a copy of all the variables and functions that F has inherited. Now, the reason I don't say child prototype equals parent prototype, actually try this. If you say child prototype equals parent prototypes, is that if you override, if you do it that way, if you just say child prototype equals parent prototype, in the child prototype, if you override a function, it overwrites it in the original parent, and we don't want to change anything in the original parent. We don't want to change any of the function in the original parent. We just want to change it on the child. So what we do is we create a copy of it. So pretty much what we did is, at this point, our child object, we've copied all the variables and functions of. We created a copy of all the variables and function of the parent object. Now, the constructor function of the child, which is the initial, the main function, which you could declare some variables and functions if you want. We don't want that to be overwritten by the parent function. We want to keep the original child constructor, which is the initial function, which you call to set up certain variables and functions. So what we do is that we tell it, copy all the variables and functions of parent to prototype, but the constructor, don't copy the parent. Keep the original child ones. So what we do is we say prototype child.prototype.constructor equals child. This is the constructor function that we're copying back. Okay, so you might not understand too much right now what this does, but I'll use it in code so you could understand it. So right now we created an extended function. This function, what basically does is, you give it a child function, you give it a parent function, and the child function will inherit all the variables and all the functions from the parent object. Okay, so now that we got that, let's create a new folder. Let's call this folder test. In this test folder, we are going to call it test01.php. Let me make sure that the okay. We want this extent to be .php, not .html. Again, I'm using PHP extension because I'm going to be using a feature of PHP to include the objects that other objects is going to need. I'm instead of using the import feature, the new feature, to make it backwards compatible with as many old browsers as possible, I'm not going to use the import. I'm going to actually use a PHP include once command to make available all the data, all the objects and all the data that I need in other objects. Okay, so I created test. Okay. So let's create a basic program. Okay. So in to make this make my code as most compatible as possible with older browsers and older mobile devices, tablets, things like that. I'm going to avoid using some of the newer commands of JavaScript. So instead of using the word import, if I want to include the the function I just created, I'm going to use a PHP command called include once. So I'm going to give it the file name. Now include once, I use include once instead of include because if I create an object that calls another object that calls another a file that calls another file that calls another file, if the other file also needs to use extend and they put include extend, I don't want the extend function to get repeated many times in the file. I only want it to be included once, and once is enough for all the other objects to see this function. So by saying include once, my PHP my JavaScript will have included the extend function. So basically, if I want to write a function, let's say I write a function called human. Let's give this function some parameters. So let's pass name and age. This, using the word this in JavaScript, is to allow for us to create variables and function that will be local, that will be used within this object we just created. So I'm going to create a variable called name, which gets the name that I just passed. And I'm going to call a variable called age, which gets the age that I just passed. Now I'm going to create some functions. Now I could create the functions two ways. I could create a function from within create a function using the this method, this variable, whatever you want to call it. So let's say, what am I? This is a function which will return a string that says human. So what am I? I'm a human. I'm also going to create another function called detail, which will return the name and the age of the object we just created. And let's call one final function called summary, which will print out to the console what the function whatever returns. And what the function detail returns. Okay, so I just created this function. Great. I could test out the function by creating a variable named human, new, of this object I just created called human as well. The name of this human is Homo sapient. Homo sapien. I hope I spelled it right. And his age is 32 years old, let's say. Okay, so I created this variable. I passed it some values, and I could call the functions. So let's say I want to call the function summary. That should calling this function in summary should write to the console log what am I, which what am I says human, and the details, which is the name and the age, which is Homo sapien in 32. So let's test that out. Hold on a second. Okay, so let's go to the console. Okay, so it's human, it printed out human, Homo sapient, and 32. No surprise there. Now, I'm going to create another function. I'm going to call it female. This function is also going to have the name and the age parameter passed to it. Now, I want female to inherit all the variables and functions from human. Now, I could do it by simply calling the extend function. So I say female, right? Now female is going to assign the name and the age to name and age. So instead of saying name equals name and age equals age, I could just call the human function again. By calling the original human function, the human constructor, but with the data from female, the variables from female, all I have to do is type the original object's name, which is human, say call, so I could call it. This will pass this object, it'll pass all of the data from female over to that function, and then the variables, which is name and age. Now if I say extend female human, by saying extend female human, what I'm doing is I'm taking all these functions and all these variables and I'm copying it over to female. So female has a variable named name, a variable named age, a function named what am I, a function named detail, a function named summary. The only thing that's changed is that the whatever variables value I place here will get called to the original one. So let's create a variable called female. Let's call her Maria. And let's say she's 50 years old. Now, female has access to all the functions of human. So I could say female.summary. I could call that function under female because it inherited. And let's see what it does. Okay, so right now it's calling it's saying the original function saying human Homo sapien 32. Now the Maria function, the female function is saying human, she's a human, Maria 50 because those were the value it passed it. Okay, now I don't want her. I want to start overriding functions, change a function variable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that instead of saying that she's a human, I'm going to say she's a female. So I'm going to do that. The proper way of doing this is actually by saying female that prototype what am I Okay, now what I'm doing here is I'm creating an object called female. Female inherits all the property of human, but it's overriding the what am I function. Now I have to change one thing in the original function. When I do this, for me to be able to override it using the prototype function, in the original human, the function should also be under prototype. So in the original human, I have to move this out. This, like I said, there's more than one way of doing this. I could have the function in this, or I could have the functions out here in prototype. Now, the proper way of doing it is doing it in prototype, because once I want to override functions easily, this will not actually override this function if it's in here. So all these functions, if I want to make them easily be able to be overwritten, I should actually write them out here saying human.prototype.what am I, human.prototype.detail, human.prototype.summary. So I've moved the function out here. So my original function for what am I says that I'm human. My female function, this should be a capital F. I've copied all the variables and functions from human, but I'm overriding the what am I function to female. So when I call summary, which is a function originally human, when the summary function calls what am I, instead of calling the what am I from its original function, which says human, it should call the what am I from my overwritten female function, which says female. So now instead of saying she's a human named Maria, 50 years old, it should say she's a female named Maria, 50 years old. So let's save this and let's run the code to see. Okay, invalid left assignment. I did a mistake somewhere. Let me see. Female prototype. What am I? There's no brackets in what am I. Let me fix that. There's no brackets here. Okay, so let me save that. And let me rerun this. Okay, so the original function called human, when I click summary, it says that he's a human Homo sapien 32 years old. Now the female function, it inherits everything from human, but I overrid the what am I to say female. So now when I call summary, instead of calling the what am I from human, which said human, is calling the what am I from female, which says female. So it says female Maria 52. So let's go back to the code. So that's something that I want to do. I want to be able to inherit the functions and variables from another object, but I want to be able to override whatever object I want at will. That's a very powerful feature of object-oriented programming. So let's create one more object just to test it out. Let's call this object male. Male will also inherit all the features from human. Let me move this up here next to female. Now the male function will also overwrite what am I, and instead of saying human or female, it's going to say male. So I could create a third variable called male. This variable is an object of male. And let's call this male Hossein. And let's say he's 33 years old. So when we call the function summary of male, when we call the object the function summary of male, it will again uh, call this function summary from human, but instead of calling the what am I function from human or the what am I function from female, which it never sees, it's gonna call its its own object that it overrode. What am I? The returns male. So the third line should say male Jose 33. Let's go see. There we go. So the first object, human Homo sapien 32, I overrode what am I in the female object. So it says female Maria 50, and I'll write the what am I in the male object to say male. So it says male Jose 33. So right now, that's pretty much what we wanted that function to do. So that extend function, which I'm going to be using quite a bit, I'm going to use a lot, making games and writing the graphical user interface. What it does is simply allows you to inherit all the variables and functions from another object, and then you could easily override any function with your own function. That's a very powerful concept. So I could also add extra functions in female, let's say. Let's say I create a function in female called extra. And this function prints to the console log the words read all about it. So not only female has inherited all the functions from human, which is summary, I could add additional functions, which only it has, and the other objects don't have. So again, it's a very powerful thing in object-oriented programming. So I could call female extra and if I call female extra, it should call the function extra, which I defined in female, saying read all about it. So there we go, read all about it. It's here, and everything else is still the same. But of course, if I try to call the extra function from the original human object, it's not going to know where it is, because this is not affecting at all the original object. So if I try to call extra from the original human object, it's not going to know what this function is. So it should give me an error. There we go. Human extra is not a function. Perfect. So there we go. We got a simple way of doing inheritance. So right now, that's it. This is a function I've added to the library, which we're going to be reusing a lot. The extend function, I'm going to try to make all these code available in GitHub or through my own website so that you could start copying them. This is a very small, simple function, which we're going to use a lot. But then I'm going to build the graphical user interface, which we're going to use in games, and I'm going to also make available the code to the games that I make. So I'm going to try to make that all available in GitHub, and I'm going to put that as a link in the description of this video. Okay, so this is the function. It's called extend. There's newer, better ways of doing this, but this is done this way to be compatible with as much old code as possible. I also don't use the the word import from JavaScript to be as compatible with the old browsers and mobile devices as possible. What I use is PHP include once command to include whatever library of code I want to use. So I want to use my extend code. I say include once. This makes the code available to my the rest of my code, so they could call it. So I said include once extend, and now I could call the extend function all the time, and I didn't have to use import. Which if I use import, it's great for newer browsers, but for older browsers, it's not going to recognize it, so the code will break. So that's it. That's the first little code that we've included to our bag of tricks, our bag of codes that we're going to be using. The next videos should be about the graphical user interface I'm going to be building for my games, and hopefully I'll write at least one of the games soon, so you could see everything working and you could see other useful code that you could reuse. Okay,